When the will was read, the entire room laughed as every dollar went to the local foundation, while he was left with a condemned, run-down rescue station. He thought he had inherited a dying building, but in truth, he had been entrusted with an unfinished promise from his adoptive father. A Navy SEAL ignored the smirks and whispers because beside him stood his loyal German shepherd, sharp-eyed, steady-footed, ready to move forward even when the road ahead was rough. In the frozen north, just the crumbling rescue station stood like a wound never stitched closed, weathering years of wind and snow in silence. Rust covered the equipment, the roof sagged in broken sections, yet the dog never stepped back, as if he sensed there was still a mission waiting to be completed. Some missions do not die with time. They wait quietly for someone strong enough to keep the promise. Where are you watching from? Like and subscribe, so we can continue sharing powerful, meaningful stories. And now, let's begin. The sky over Northwind Lake was painfully clear. It was the kind of northern light that showed everything, every wrinkle in bark, every ripple in water, every flaw in a man's composure. There were no clouds to hide behind. Declan Crow stood with his hands folded loosely in front of him, boots planted on the thin grass overlooking the cemetery slope. At 6'1", he was taller than most of the men gathered, but he did not loom. He stood still in a way that suggested control rather than dominance. He was clean-shaven, as always. No beard softened the edges of his square jaw. His cheekbones were sharp beneath skin weathered lightly by wind and cold. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, slightly longer than regulation but still precise. There was nothing casual about him. Even at rest, his posture held the straight-line geometry of training that never quite leaves the body. His tactical combat shirt olive faded toward gray fit, close without being tight. The fabric had softened over years of use, the cuffs faintly frayed. A darker red thermal layer showed at the collar. His combat pants were worn at the knees. Earth-toned. Practical. Old work boots anchored him to the ground. A scratched military watch circled his wrist, ticking with indifferent accuracy. Beside him sat Echo. The German shepherd was 6 years old, sable-coated cream underlayer shadowed by gray and black along his back. His amber eyes were steady and intelligent. The dog's posture mirrored Declan's, composed, alert without strain. A black harness with muted dark red trim rested against his chest. He did not whine or pull. He simply watched. At the center of the gathering stood the casket of Captain Rowan Hale. Rowan had been built like old oak-thick hands, broad chest, hair gone white before 50. A retired naval officer turned lake rescue coordinator, he had carried authority without raising his voice. The lines in his face had not been carved by anger, but by weather. He had taken Declan in 15 years ago, when Declan had been 20 and drifting toward something harder and less forgiving. Rowan had not rescued him with warmth. He had rescued him with structure. The pastor's voice moved gently through the air, speaking of service, dedication, duty to community. Words. Declan had learned how words could float harmlessly above reality. He felt nothing dramatic, no collapse, no visible fracture. Grief, he knew, did not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it sank quietly and changed the gravity of everything. Behind him stood Grace Whitaker. Grace was tall and narrow-shouldered, her posture slightly curved inward as though protecting something invisible. Her dark blonde hair had faded into pale strands, streaked with silver. She wore a charcoal wool coat that hung loosely from her frame. Her face was thin, almost fragile, but her blue eyes carried something harder than sorrow endurance. 12 years ago, She had screamed at Rowan in front of half the town. Her son, Noah Whitaker, had been 8 when he vanished during a sudden storm on the lake. Rowan had led the search. They never found the boy. Grace had never forgiven him. Or perhaps she had never forgiven the water. Declan could not tell. Echo shifted slightly. His ears angled toward the lake rather than the pastor. But a low rumble vibrated in his chest. Soft, not aggressive. Alert. Declan glanced down, fingers brushing lightly against the dog's neck. Easy. Echo did not relax. The lake shimmered in the distance, deceptively calm. After the burial, the small group dispersed slowly. Northwind was not a large town. Grief moved through it like a familiar season. Inside Hale's modest home near the docks, the reading of the will began. The lawyer, Thomas Ridley, was a thin man in his late 50s with wire-framed glasses and carefully parted silver hair. He wore a brown suit that looked perpetually one season behind fashion. His voice was precise, almost apologetic, as though he regretted every sentence before speaking it. Declan sat at the wooden dining table Rowan had built himself. Echo lay at his feet. Grace Whitaker remained near the window, hands clasped tightly together. Ridley cleared his throat. But Captain Rowan Hale left the majority of his financial holdings to the Northwind Community Development Trust. There was quiet acceptance in the room. Then Ridley continued. To Declan Crow, I leave ownership of Northwind Station. Declan blinked once. Northwind Station, the old rescue outpost on the east side of the lake. Structurally sound, but neglected. Condemned for public use 2 years prior. Ridley hesitated, then unfolded a second paper. And a personal letter. He slid it across the table. Declan's fingers were steady as he picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable firm, slightly slanted. You know why I couldn't finish it. I never brought him home. Bring the boy back to his mother. The room seemed to tilt. Declan felt something shift, not sharp, but deep. Grace inhaled sharply. Echo stood. Without barking, without warning, the dog walked to the door and sat facing it, staring toward the lake beyond the house. Silence pressed in. And then, Echo let out one short, low bark. Not alarm, not fear, recognition. The sound cut through the air like a dropped stone in still water. Declan felt the hairs rise along his forearms. For a moment, just one, he had the uncanny sensation that someone else had entered the room. But the door was closed. The lake lay still beyond the glass. Grace turned toward the sound, her expression shifting from guarded grief to something raw and uncertain. Ridley cleared his throat again, uncomfortable. Declan looked down at the letter in his hand. The words did not change. Bring the boy back. The rehook settled not in the room, but in his chest. Rowan had not asked him to inherit a building. He had asked him to reopen a wound, and that meant something had been left unfinished. Declan stood slowly. He walked to the door Echo faced and opened it. Cold northern air spilled into the house, clean and sharp. The lake stretched wide beneath the afternoon sun, bright enough to hurt the eyes. Echo stepped forward, nostrils flaring, and gaze fixed somewhere beyond what humans could measure. Declan folded the letter once and slipped it into his pocket. He had planned to stay in Northwind for 2 days. Attend the funeral. Sign papers. Return to base. The military had offered him time after the last mission, after the water, after the silence, after the body they did not recover in time. He had told himself he was fine. Grace stepped closer, her voice barely steady. Did he... Say anything else? Declan met her eyes. Gray-blue to pale blue. Just that he didn't finish. Grace swallowed. She nodded once, sharply, as if bracing against hope. Declan stepped outside. Northwind Station stood across the lake's eastern bend, a silhouette of wood and metal against the trees. Weathered. Waiting. Echo moved ahead of him toward the dock. The dog paused, looking back only once, as if asking a question. Declan exhaled slowly. The lake shimmered under the vast northern sky. He felt the weight of the watch against his wrist, and he felt the weight of the letter in his pocket. Rowan Hale had not given him money. He had given him a responsibility. Declan Crow did not believe in ghosts, but he believed in unfinished things, and the lake did not forget. He stepped forward toward Northwind Station. Echo walked at his side. The sky remained painfully clear. Morning came cold and precise. Declan reached Northwind Station just after sunrise, boots crunching over frost that had formed overnight along the wooden planks of the dock. The building stood at the eastern bend of the lake, a weathered structure of cedar siding and steel roof, angled slightly toward the water, as if still watching for distress signals. The lake was unnervingly calm. He paused before unlocking the station door. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass square jaw, a pale wind-burned skin, eyes that never quite softened. The old tactical shirt moved against his shoulders as he exhaled. Echo stood to his right, head lifted, nostrils flaring. The German shepherd's sable coat caught the thin sunlight, black ridge along his spine tapering into ash gray and cream. Echo did not bark. He scanned. Declan turned the key. Inside, the air smelled of old rope, lake water, and engine oil. The rescue station had once been the center of emergency response on Northwind maps pinned to corkboard, radios on metal shelves, faded life jackets hanging like relics of unfinished sentences. He walked slowly through the main room, fingers brushing the wooden table scarred by years of use. Rowan's presence lingered here in practical details, the precise placement of tools, labels written in block letters, maintenance logs stacked neatly despite the station's closure. As Declan moved to the back wall, where a large topographical map of Northwind Lake was still mounted under plastic, red grease pencil marks dotted the surface-old search patterns, coordinates, grid lines. He leaned closer. 12 years ago. The area marked Primary Sweep covered the western inlet. The eastern basin, deeper and colder, had fewer markings. Echo's nails clicked sharply against the wooden floor. The dog moved toward the far corner near a rusted metal locker. He lowered his head, sniffing the baseboard, then lifted it again, ears pricked toward the open doorway that faced the lake. Declan crouched beside him. "What do you hear?" Echo's body was still. Only the slight twitch of his ear betrayed attention. Declan straightened and stepped outside. The lake stretched wide under morning light. The surface reflected blue sky so clearly it felt like staring into height rather than depth. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through archived reports Naomi Calder had sent him overnight. Dr. Naomi Calder was a hydrologist in her early 30s, lean and practical, with short brown hair that brushed her jawline and skin dusted lightly with sun freckles from years of fieldwork. She dressed without ceremony olive field jacket, dark cargo pants, boots permanently scuffed. Her brown eyes held intelligence sharpened by frustration. She had once worked for the State Environmental Bureau until she refused to sign off on a report she believed understated contamination levels. After that, she went independent. Her message was brief. Thermocline sits at approximately 28 to 32 feet this time of year. Below that, water temperature likely near 4 degrees Celsius. Eastern Basin has undercurrent anomalies, possible subsurface obstruction. Declan studied the map again. La Bamba. Rowan had written the words in the margin 12 years ago. Compass interference. What he traced the Eastern Basin with his finger. If the search grid had drifted even 3 degrees off course during heavy storm winds, that could have shifted the sweep zone by dozens of yards. Dozens of yards. Enough. Behind him, footsteps approached along the dock. Declan turned. Eldon Pike. Eldon was 72, and shaped like a man who had been sturdy once and refused to entirely surrender it. His shoulders remained broad despite age, though one sat slightly lower than the other, a reminder of a long-healed fracture from a dock accident decades earlier. His beard was short and white, neatly trimmed, his skin thickened by wind exposure. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into worn denim and carried a thermos under one arm. "You're up early," Eldon said, voice gravelly but not unfriendly. Declan nodded. "You still think it was the East Basin?" Eldon stepped closer to the map. "I was there that night," he said quietly. "Storm came down fast. Lightning too close. Compass spun on Hale's boat, once thought it was nerves." "You tell anyone?" Eldon shook his head slowly. "Who would have listened? Storm's easier to blame than equipment." Declan watched the older man's eyes. There was no deception there. Only memory. Echo stepped between them and moved toward the shoreline, tail low but steady. He stopped at the end of the dock and stared into the water, not scanning the horizon, but focusing on a fixed point roughly 70 yards out. Declan followed his line of sight. Nothing. Just light dancing over surface ripples. Eldon squinted. "You think the dog smells something?" Declan didn't answer. Echo lowered his body slightly, muscles engaged. And then he released a single sharp bark. It echoed across the lake. The sound felt out of place in the quiet morning, too precise to be random. Declan felt his pulse quicken. Not from fear, but recognition. The bark had not been reactive. It had been directional. He stepped forward slowly, boots thudding softly on wood. He narrowed his gaze, adjusting for glare. For a fraction of a second, barely visible beneath the shifting light, something disrupted the water's pattern. A subtle distortion, a straight line where there should have been curve. Declan's breath slowed. Not revelation. Not proof. Just disturbance. The moment passed. The surface returned to stillness. Eldon rubbed his jaw. "Maybe driftwood." "Maybe," Declan said. But Echo did not relax. The dog remained locked in place, staring. And Declan felt something else, something quieter than adrenaline. A pull. He turned back toward the station. "Sonar," he said. Eldon blinked. "You got one?" "Civilian unit in the truck." Eldon let out a low whistle. "You planning on doing this proper?" Declan didn't look at him. "I'm planning on not guessing." They spent the next hour mounting the portable sonar system along a small aluminum skiff that still rested beside the station. The boat creaked under weight but held steady. Echo remained on shore, watching. When Declan pushed off and began scanning the Eastern Basin, the lake swallowed the boat's hum quickly. Grid by grid. Slow arcs. Declan kept his breathing controlled, eyes flicking between surface and digital display. For several passes, nothing unusual appeared, only natural rock formations and silt ridges. Then, on the fourth sweep, a geometric outline, rectangular, metallic density signature. Declan steadied the skiff. He ran the sweep again. The shape remained. Approximately 35 feet down, offset from the official search zone by roughly 50 yards. Eldon leaned closer to the screen. "That ain't driftwood." Declan swallowed. The cold northern air suddenly felt sharper. If the compass drift had altered Hale's original sweep even slightly, 50 yards, 12 years. Echo barked again from shore. Not frantic, insistent. Declan shut off the sonar. He stared at the lake's surface for a long moment. This was no longer about suspicion. This was geometry. Misalignment. He secured the equipment and guided the boat back to dock. Eldon stepped aside as Declan climbed out. "You gonna dive?" Declan shook his head. "Not alone." Echo approached him immediately, pressing lightly against his thigh. Sensing the shift in tension, Declan rested a hand on the dog's head. As the lake was still, too still. He looked at the distant shoreline where Northwind Town rested small against pine trees. 12 years ago, a storm had swallowed a child. Today, the sky was clear enough to see every mile. He reached into his pocket and unfolded Rowan's letter again. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze. "Bring the boy back." Declan folded it carefully and returned it to his pocket. He did not feel triumph. He felt responsibility. He turned toward the station. Just already thinking through next steps permits, county authorization, dive team coordination. Echo walked beside him. The lake behind them shimmered quietly, holding whatever it had held all this time. Declan did not look back again. Not yet. The permit came through faster than Declan expected. Not because anyone rushed it, but because the language used in his request had been precise. Possible unregistered metallic obstruction, environmental hazard, public safety risk. Those words moved bureaucracy more efficiently than grief ever could. By late afternoon, a small county dive unit truck rolled down the gravel approach to Northwind Station. The vehicle was plain white, its paint dulled by salt and winter wear. But 2 divers stepped out first. The first was Sergeant Mark Hensley, early 40s, compact and muscular in the way of men who carry weight close to bone. His dark beard was trimmed short, but not neat. A thin scar cut through his left eyebrow. He walked with deliberate economy, neither rushed nor relaxed. Hensley had once served in the Coast Guard before transferring to County Search and Recovery. He spoke little, observed much, and did not tolerate theatrics. The second diver, Caleb Torres, was younger mid-30s, taller, broad-shouldered, but slightly loose in posture. His skin carried a permanent bronze from years outdoors. His black hair was shaved close at the sides. There was something steady about him, something careful. Torres had lost a brother to a river accident when he was 19. It had shaped him into a man who approached water not with fear, but with respect. Naomi Calder arrived minutes later in her mud-streaked SUV. So she stepped out in the same field jacket, clipboard tucked beneath one arm, hair pulled back in a simple tie. Her face held no outward emotion, but her eyes were sharp with calculation. She greeted Hensley with a nod, then glanced at Declan. "You certain about the depth reading?" 35 feet, Declan replied. "Give or take." She nodded once. "Thermocline's stable today. That helps." Echo moved along the dock quietly, studying each new arrival without growling. His amber eyes tracked movements, tail low but not tense. He approached Torres first, sniffed his gloved hand, then retreated. Satisfied. The air held a metallic chill as they unloaded equipment. Dry suits, oxygen tanks, underwater lights. Declan stripped down to his thermal base layer and began pulling on his own dive gear. The neoprene clung tightly to his shoulders, and he had not worn a dive suit since the last mission overseas, the one where the water had turned dark and silent and uncooperative. He adjusted the regulator with slow, practiced fingers. Hensley stepped closer. "You diving with us?" "Yes." Hensley studied him briefly. "You follow my lead. We're not chasing ghosts." Declan nodded. "I don't chase ghosts." Echo whined softly from the dock's edge. Declan crouched beside him, placing a hand against the dog's thick neck. "Stay." Echo held his gaze, an understanding in a way that was not mystical but earned. Declan stood and stepped into the boat. The eastern basin lay quiet beneath afternoon sun. The water's surface reflected sky so cleanly, it was almost deceptive. Beneath that reflection, cold layered itself in invisible bands. They reached the sonar coordinates. Hensley checked his gauge. 36 feet here. We descend slow." Declan secured his mask and regulator. The world narrowed to breath and heartbeat. They slipped into the lake. The first shock of cold hit even through insulation, a clean, biting pressure against skin. Yet the descent was gradual, controlled. Bubbles rose around them in silver ribbons. Light faded quickly. At 15 feet, the water shifted. Temperature dropped sharply as they crossed the thermocline. The sensation was immediate, like passing through an unseen curtain. Declan felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear exactly, but memory. The last time he had descended into dark water, he had come up alone. He pushed that thought aside. 20 feet, 25. At 30, the lake floor began to take shape, shadowed ridges of silt and rock. Then, there it was. A structure. Angular. Artificial. Not a boat. A rectangular steel housing embedded partially in sediment, one corner exposed. Rust traced its edges like veins. One panel appeared slightly bent. Hensley motioned for caution. Declan moved closer, light cutting through suspended particles. The beam revealed rivets along one seam and faded industrial lettering barely visible under corrosion. Matt said he felt his pulse thudding steadily in his ears. This was not part of any documented civilian wreck. Torres circled the opposite side carefully. Declan's light drifted along the metal surface, then froze. Fabric. A strip of faded blue cloth trapped beneath a bent edge of steel. Small. Child-sized. The current moved gently, causing it to stir like something breathing. Declan's throat tightened despite the regulator. He did not reach for it. Not yet. Hensley signaled. "Mark the site." Torres secured a floating buoy line above them. Declan's vision tunneled slightly as memory surged, not visual, but tactile. The feeling of reaching too late. The sensation of empty water where someone should have been. He forced his breathing to remain even. They ascended slowly, respecting decompression timing despite the shallow depth. When Declan broke the surface, the air felt warmer than it had hours before. He removed his mask. Naomi leaned forward from the boat, eyes searching his face. "Well?" He swallowed once. "Metal housing. Industrial, not a civilian vessel." "And?" she pressed gently. "There's fabric." Naomi's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. On the dock, Echo stood utterly still. When the boat reached shore, the dog did not bark or jump. He stepped forward slowly, pressing his nose against Declan's wet glove, then lifting his head toward the lake, as if confirming something long suspected. And then, without warning, Echo lay down flat against the dock, chin resting between his paws, eyes fixed on the water. Not submission. Not exhaustion. Waiting. The moment felt heavy with meaning, though no words explained it. Grace Whitaker stood at the far end of the dock. Declan had not seen her arrive. She wore the same charcoal coat as before, her thin fingers wrapped tightly around the railing. Her pale hair moved slightly in the breeze, her eyes clearer today than at the funeral locked onto his. You found something, she said. It was not a question. Declan stepped toward her slowly. There's a structure down there, he replied carefully, and material consistent with clothing. Grace closed her eyes briefly. The lines around her mouth deepened, but she did not cry. Instead, she exhaled a long breath that seemed to carry 12 years with it. Then he wasn't lost, she whispered. He was held. The word struck Declan harder than he expected. Held. By steel. By water. By time. Hensley approached them, professional tone steady. We'll need official clearance for recovery. Could take a day or two. Grace nodded once, absorbing that with the composure of someone who had already endured far worse delays. Declan removed his gloves, fingers pale from cold. Echo rose from his place and moved to stand beside Grace now, not touching, but near enough that his warmth seemed intentional. Naomi joined them quietly. If this housing isn't registered, she said softly, someone failed to report it. Declan stared back at the lake. Someone knew. The metal did not sink itself. The fabric did not entangle by accident. The sky above remained bright and unforgiving. He felt no triumph, only a tightening resolve. Grace looked at him again. You'll finish it, she said, not pleading, not demanding. Stating. Declan met her gaze. Yes. The wind shifted slightly, rippling the lake's surface. Echo lifted his head and stared outward once more. Not restless, not searching. Certain. Declan did not speak further. There was still process ahead, documentation, retrieval, verification. But the geometry had changed. The boy was no longer a story. He was a location. And the lake had begun to give something back. The lake looked harmless in the afternoon. Declan had learned that harmless surfaces often hid complicated machinery beneath them. County vehicles had come and gone throughout the morning. Yellow marker buoys now bobbed in quiet formation above the identified site. A thin line of floating rope defined the perimeter. Official. Temporary. Necessary. Northwind Station felt different with equipment stacked along the wall air compressors, documentation forms, sealed evidence bags. The building, what once neglected, now carried tension in its wooden beams. Declan stood outside, arms folded, watching wind ripple across the eastern basin. Echo sat beside him, harness black against sable fur, ears scanning the tree line rather than the water. He sensed them before he saw them. Tires on gravel. Smooth. Expensive. A dark SUV rolled slowly down the access road and came to a controlled stop near the dock. The driver's door opened first. Sloane Kerrigan stepped out. She was tall, around 5'9", lean, without fragility. Her posture was exact, shoulders square, chin level. Her dark brown hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck, no loose strands allowed. She wore a tailored charcoal coat over fitted trousers and low-heeled leather boots, practical enough for uneven ground, but too refined for utility. Her face was composed in the way of someone who rarely raised her voice, because she never needed to. Her eyes were gray, not soft gray, but steel-toned. Yet she closed the door gently and walked toward the dock without hurry. A second man exited the passenger side. Troy Baines, mid-20s, athletic in the way of someone who once relied on charm and speed more than discipline. Clean-shaven, sharp cheekbones, bright smile that lingered a second too long. He wore a fitted navy jacket over a light shirt, sleeves rolled precisely. His movements were quick, but slightly nervous, like a dog who had learned to pretend confidence. Echo rose immediately. He did not growl. He watched. Sloane stopped a few feet from Declan, maintaining polite distance. "Mr. Crow," she said, voice smooth, controlled. "I'm sorry for your loss." Declan gave a slight nod. "You know why I'm here?" Her gaze drifted to the buoy line in the distance. "I do." Troy glanced at the equipment, then at Naomi, who stood near the station door reviewing notes. Naomi did not acknowledge him. Sloane folded her hands lightly in front of her coat. "I understand a structure has been identified beneath the lake." Declan did not offer more than that. She smiled faintly. "You must appreciate that submerged infrastructure, especially industrial, falls under corporate and environmental jurisdiction." Echo shifted closer to Declan's leg. Sloane noticed. "Beautiful animal," she said evenly. "He listens," Declan replied. She held his gaze for a fraction longer than courtesy required. "There was a research platform in this region 12 years ago. Was a prototype energy housing. It malfunctioned during testing. Decommissioned. Sunk intentionally under supervision. Not documented publicly," Naomi said from behind them. Sloane turned slightly, assessing her. "Dr. Calder," she acknowledged. "Still fond of independent investigations." Naomi's expression did not change. "Still fond of full disclosure." Troy exhaled quietly through his nose, suppressing something like impatience. Sloane continued. "If your team interferes with sealed industrial property, a liability becomes complicated." Declan's voice remained calm. Child clothing was observed at the site. Sloane did not flinch. "Correlation is not causation." Echo's ears flattened slightly. Wind lifted across the water, carrying a low hum from somewhere unseen. Then, without warning, Echo stepped forward, body rigid, eyes locked not on Sloane, but on Troy. Troy shifted uncomfortably. Echo moved closer, nose lowering toward Troy's boots. He inhaled once, twice. Then he let out a low, steady growl. Not aggressive, not explosive, certain. Troy's smile faltered. Sloane's gaze sharpened, but she did not step back. "Control your dog," she said, voice cooling. "He is controlled," Declan replied. Echo's growl deepened briefly, then stopped as abruptly as it began. He stepped back to Declan's side. Silence stretched, for a heartbeat too long. Troy cleared his throat. "Maybe we should let the county handle it." Sloane's jaw tightened subtly, but her composure returned. "I'm offering you an alternative," she said to Declan. "We fund a full forensic recovery under corporate supervision, discretion assured, compensation for your cooperation." Compensation. The word hung in the air. Declan felt something shift behind his ribs. Not temptation, but recognition. This was not about obstruction. It was about control. Grace Whitaker approached from the station entrance, coat wrapped tightly around her thin frame. Her pale hair caught light like frost, and she stopped near Declan. "Is this about my son?" she asked. Sloane turned to her, expression softened deliberately. "Mrs. Whitaker, I assure you our company has no interest in preventing closure." Grace's hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. Closure isn't yours to grant. Sloane's eyes returned to Declan. You have military clearance, she said. You understand strategic containment. Declan held her gaze. I understand recovery. The wind shifted again. Somewhere beyond the buoy line, a small disturbance rippled the surface, though no boat moved. Echo looked toward it, but did not bark. Sloane watched the water for a moment, then stepped back. We'll be in contact, she said calmly. She turned, coat catching briefly in the breeze. Troy followed, casting one last glance toward the lake. When the SUV pulled away, gravel crunching beneath expensive tires, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Naomi stepped forward. She knew about the structure before we confirmed it publicly. Declan nodded. She expected it to stay buried. Grace stared at the lake. They left him there. Declan did not answer immediately. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same sensation before breaching unknown spaces underwater. Not fear, anticipation. He turned to Hensley, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange. You heard that? Hensley nodded once. Corporate property claim complicates things. Does it stop recovery? Hensley considered. Not if there's probable cause of human remains. Declan looked back at the water. The geometry had shifted again. This was no longer only about location. It was about resistance. Echo stepped forward, placing himself between Grace and the lake as if shielding without touching. Declan rested a hand on the dog's back. Sloane had not denied the platform. She had confirmed it. And confirmation changed weight. Declan felt something colder than the lake's depth settle into him. Someone had chosen silence 12 years ago. Now silence was thinning. He walked toward the edge of the dock and looked down at the reflection of his own face in the water. Clean-shaven, controlled, unmoved. But beneath the surface, currents always existed. He turned back toward the station. File the recovery request formally, he said to Naomi. Hensley nodded. Grace exhaled slowly. Echo remained watchful. The lake shimmered under unbroken sky. Declan knew something now that he hadn't known yesterday. The metal had been placed intentionally, and someone had hoped it would never be disturbed. He did not look toward the road where the SUV had disappeared. There would be time for that. For now, the work remained simple. Bring the boy home. Nothing else mattered. The official recovery permit arrived just before dawn. Declan was already awake. Sleep had come in fragments, thin layers of rest, broken by the steady rhythm of wind against the station windows. Echo had not left his side through the night. The dog lay across the doorway, body stretched long, head resting on his paws, but eyes half open, alert even in stillness. When Naomi's truck headlights cut across the frosted yard, Echo rose without a sound. And the morning air carried a sharper cold than the previous days. The lake's surface looked almost metallic beneath the pale northern light, a flat sheet reflecting nothing. Today would not be quiet. By 7, the recovery team had assembled. Sergeant Hensley stood at the center of coordination, clipboard tucked beneath one arm. His expression was unchanged, professional restraint, wrapped tightly around something heavier. Caleb Torres checked his equipment with deliberate care, movements economical, was breathing slow. A third vehicle arrived shortly after. Deputy Alan Reeves stepped out. He was late 30s, tall but slightly stooped, as if long hours in patrol cars had shaped his spine. His sandy blonde hair was cut short, but not styled. A faint shadow of stubble framed his jaw. His eyes were a pale blue that held more fatigue than suspicion. Reeves had been a junior officer 12 years ago when the lake incident occurred. He remembered it, though not officially. He walked toward Declan with cautious respect. "I'll be overseeing perimeter compliance," he said. His voice was steady, but there was something under it. "Chain of custody needs to be airtight." Declan nodded once. Grace Whitaker stood a few yards back from the dock, wrapped in a heavy wool coat. She had insisted on being present. Her face was pale, but set with quiet resolve. No tears. Not yet. Sloane Kerrigan was not there. That absence felt deliberate. The barge arrived mid-morning, a flat industrial platform equipped with crane apparatus and lifting rigging. 2 contracted recovery specialists operated it. One of them, Elias Mercer, was in his early 50s. Broad-shouldered, thick hands marked by decades of mechanical labor. His dark skin bore sun lines along the edges of his eyes. His voice carried a low southern drawl that softened his otherwise imposing build. He studied the coordinates and nodded. "We bring it up slow," he said. "A steel like that shifts when pressure changes." Declan suited up alongside the dive team. Echo remained on shore, positioned at the edge of the dock. He did not pace. He did not whine. He watched. The descent this time carried more purpose. No searching, no uncertainty. Declan felt the lake close around him as before, the cold pressing into the seams of his suit, the weight of water compressing breath into measured rhythm. They reached the structure. Metal gleamed faintly beneath accumulated silt. The crane hook descended carefully, guided by Hensley's signals. Chains were threaded through exposed frame sections. Declan's light drifted once more along the bent panel. The strip of blue fabric still stirred gently beneath it. He forced himself to focus on task. Secure. Stabilize. Clear sediment from anchor points. Torres tapped his shoulder and pointed toward the rear edge of the housing. A section of paneling bore impact marks, deep, concave dents, inconsistent with simple corrosion. Deliberate force. Declan felt the cold tighten along his spine. He did not signal yet. They completed attachment. The barge engine hummed faintly above. The structure began to rise, slow, heavy. As the steel lifted from the lake floor, sediment bloomed outward in dark clouds. Declan's visibility dropped instantly, and then, through the swirling silt, something shifted inside the housing. Not movement, not alive, but displacement. A shape settling under gravity. Declan's pulse kicked once, hard. The lake felt suddenly smaller. Echo barked once, sharp, not panicked commanding. The sound cut across the water from above, filtered down through 35 feet of depth as a muted vibration. Declan froze. Echo did not bark without cause. The crane winch hesitated momentarily at Hensley's signal. Declan angled his light toward the interior gap where the bent panel had widened under lift. For a brief second, just one, his beam caught something pale within the darkness. Smooth, small, and then the sediment swallowed it again. His breath fogged inside the mask despite cold regulation. The structure continued rising, slow, controlled. Declan did not chase the image. He held position. When they breached surface, the housing emerged from water like something reluctant to exist in daylight. Steel dripped. Rust streaked. The crane swung the load toward the dock, where plastic sheeting and forensic tarps waited. Grace stepped back instinctively. Deputy Reeves moved forward, her face tightening. "Document everything," he said quietly. The housing settled onto reinforced supports. Mercer approached with cutting tools but waited for clearance. Naomi stood beside Declan as he removed his mask. "You saw something," she said, not accusing, knowing. He nodded once. "Inside." Grace closed her eyes briefly. Mercer began removing the bent panel carefully, slicing through corroded bolts with controlled precision. The smell that escaped was not dramatic. It was cold, metallic, old. No rot, no fresh decay. Time preserved what it trapped. When the panel finally gave way and was lifted aside, the interior revealed itself. The housing was not hollow. It contained an inner containment frame, smaller, reinforced. And within that frame, a skeletal form lay partially secured by deteriorated harness straps. Small bones, delicate, intact. The blue fabric fragment connected unmistakably to what remained of a child's jacket. Grace did not scream. She inhaled once, a sound almost like relief. Deputy Reeves removed his hat slowly. Even Hensley's shoulders shifted subtly. Declan stood very still. The world narrowed again, but not in panic, in gravity. Echo did not bark this time. He sat, watching, as if the waiting had ended. Forensics moved carefully. Photographs, measurements, bagging of remains. Each motion carried ritual weight. Grace approached the edge of the perimeter tape. Declan stepped beside her, not touching, but present. "He wasn't lost," she said quietly. No," Declan replied. She turned toward him. "They put him there." It was not hysteria. It was deduction. Declan nodded. "The platform malfunction wasn't the whole story." Deputy Reeves shifted uneasily at that. Grace saw it. "You knew," she said softly. "Not accusation. Not anger." Reeves swallowed. "I was junior patrol," he admitted. "We were told it was a tragic accident during an unsanctioned dive by the boy. Corporate filed a report. It closed fast." Declan studied him. "You believed it?" Reeves hesitated. "I wanted to." Silence settled again. The lake behind them shimmered as if indifferent. But something fundamental had changed. The structure had been raised. The boy had been found. The narrative 12 years old had fractured. Naomi stepped closer, holding a sealed evidence bag. "Impact damage inside the housing," she said quietly to Declan, "and restraints inconsistent with safety harnessing." Deliberate containment, not accident. Declan felt the cold not on his skin now, but beneath it. Echo stood and moved closer to the tarp, where the remains lay, stopping short at the boundary line. He lowered his head briefly, not sniffing, not intruding. Acknowledging. Declan rested a hand against the dog's back. The sun climbed higher. News vehicles gathered at a distance. Sloane Kerrigan's SUV did not return. Grace straightened. "I'd like him buried beside his father," she said calmly. Deputy Reeves nodded. "I'll ensure release procedures move quickly." Declan looked out across the lake one final time. It looked exactly as it had days ago. Flat, bright, unassuming. But the geometry beneath it had shifted permanently. He felt no triumph, only completion of one piece of something larger. Someone had sealed a child inside steel. Someone had signed off on silence. Now steel had opened, and silence had cracked. Declan turned back toward the station. There was more to uncover. But for today, the boy was no longer beneath water. He was above it. And that mattered. The lake returned to silence the day after the recovery. Media vans had come and gone. Caution tape fluttered where the barge had docked. The steel housing now sat inside a secured evidence hangar on county property, guarded and sealed. Northwind Station felt hollow without the machinery. Declan stood at the edge of the dock at first light, hands tucked beneath his arms against the cold. Echo sat beside him, sable coat brushed by wind, amber eyes steady on the water, but not searching anymore. But the waiting had shifted. Now it was no longer about finding. It was about proving. Naomi arrived just after sunrise, carrying a thick folder pressed against her chest. "There's more," she said quietly. Declan followed her inside the station. Spread across the wooden table were printed schematics of the submerged platform acquired overnight through archived environmental filings. Naomi had driven 3 hours the previous evening to retrieve them from a state records annex. The design was complex but clear. The housing that contained the remains was not part of the original structural blueprint. It was an addition. Welded in later. Declan traced the lines with one finger. "This wasn't malfunction containment," he said. "No," Naomi replied. "It was modification." Deputy Reeves entered moments later, uniform jacket unzipped, hat tucked under his arm. He looked more tired than before. "I pulled archived incident reports," he said. The platform was scheduled for dismantling 2 weeks after the accident. That dismantling never happened. "Why?" Naomi asked. Reeves hesitated. "Corporate bought the land rights outright the following month. Full transfer." Silence settled. Declan felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not panic, not anger. Clarity. A knock sounded at the station door. It was not urgent, not aggressive. Measured. Declan opened it. A man stood on the threshold. Mid-50s. Tall but slightly stooped at the shoulders, as though decades of administrative work had curved his posture. His suit was clean but old-fashioned, cut from heavier fabric than modern tailoring. His thinning hair was combed carefully over a widening crown. Wire-rimmed glasses rested low on his nose. "Mr. Crow," he said politely. "I'm Daniel Harrow." His voice was soft, controlled. "Corporate legal counsel." Declan stepped aside. Harrow entered slowly, eyes scanning the room without appearing to do so. "I represent Kerrigan Energy," he said, "specifically matters related to former research infrastructure." Echo stood but did not bark. Harrow's gaze flicked briefly toward the dog. "I assure you," he continued, "the company is committed to cooperation." Naomi folded her arms. "Then explain the undocumented modification." Harrow removed a thin leather portfolio and placed it carefully on the table. "The internal containment frame," he said, choosing words precisely, "was installed as an emergency stabilization mechanism following structural compromise." Declan studied him. "Before or after the boy entered it?" Harrow did not react immediately. He adjusted his glasses. "The company's position remains that the minor gained unauthorized access." Grace Whitaker entered quietly behind them. She wore the same wool coat, hair pulled back tightly today, her face composed but sharpened. "He was 9, she said. Harrow inclined his head slightly. "Tragic accidents often involve minors." Echo's ears flattened. Declan felt heat rise beneath his collarbone, controlled, contained. Naomi stepped closer to the schematics. "This weld pattern," she said, pointing, "is external reinforcement. It was applied after the structure was submerged." Harrow's lips pressed thin. "Post-incident remediation efforts are complex." Echo moved suddenly, not toward Harrow, toward the table. He placed one paw gently on the edge of the schematic papers and lowered his nose to a specific marking an area circled in faded red ink that none of them had noticed before. A hand-drawn annotation. Initials. DK. Echo did not move. He held position, staring at the mark. Declan leaned closer. Daniel Kerrigan, Naomi whispered. The founder. Sloane's father. Harrow's composure shifted barely but enough. That notation is irrelevant, he said smoothly. Declan looked at him. Then why does it look handwritten? Harrow straightened. The founder conducted oversight reviews. On concealed modifications? Naomi pressed. Harrow closed the portfolio carefully. I am here to advise discretion. Grace stepped forward. You sealed my child inside steel. Harrow's voice remained even. The company sealed a liability. Silence fell hard. Reeves shifted uneasily near the doorway. Declan's hands remained steady at his sides, but inside something locked into place. He had seen men like Harrow before, men who believed language could soften gravity. You're not here to cooperate, Declan said quietly. Harrow's gaze met his. I am here to prevent escalation. Escalation of what? Naomi asked. Harrow did not answer directly. There are interests beyond this county, he said instead. Federal contracts, defense partnerships. You understand how sensitive those relationships are. Declan held his gaze. I understand containment. Harrow paused. Then, and quietly, Miss Kerrigan will be making a public statement tomorrow. We recommend alignment. Grace let out a brittle laugh. Alignment? Harrow gathered his portfolio. My advice, he said gently, is to allow corporate internal investigation to proceed. He turned toward the door. Echo stepped aside, but did not break eye contact. When Harrow exited, the air felt colder. Naomi exhaled slowly. He confirmed involvement without admitting it. Reeves rubbed the back of his neck. If the founder signed off on post-submersion modification, he trailed off. Declan looked back at the red-circled initials. DK. The welds had been applied after the housing sank. Someone had opened it. Someone had closed it again. Grace moved closer to the table. What happens now? She asked. Declan's voice remained steady. Now, it becomes criminal. Reeves nodded reluctantly. I'll escalate to state level. Naomi folded the schematics carefully. We need forensic analysis of the weld seams. Timeline confirmation. Declan stepped outside. Echo followed. The lake looked unchanged. Flat. Bright. But the surface now felt like a thin lid over something far larger. Declan inhaled deeply, cold air filling his lungs. He thought of steel under pressure, of bolts tightened deliberately, of a founder's initials marking quiet approval. Corporate narratives were built like containment frames, layered, reinforced, sealed, but steel fractured. Under the right pressure. Echo sat beside him, gaze forward. Declan rested a hand against the dog's neck. You knew, he murmured, not to Echo, not to himself. The geometry had expanded. This was no longer only about concealment. It was about authority. And authority had left handwriting. Inside, Naomi began drafting formal escalation reports. Grace stood by the window, staring at the lake not as a void, but as a witness. Deputy Reeves stepped outside after a moment. They'll fight this, he said quietly. Declan nodded. They should. The wind shifted again, lifting small ripples across the surface. Echo watched, calm. The boy had been found. Now responsibility had surfaced. Declan felt no triumph, only momentum. The steel had cracked, and what came through it would not go back. He turned toward the station. There was work to do. The press conference was held on the courthouse steps. Not at the lake, not at Northwind Station, neutral ground. Declan stood at the edge of the crowd rather than beside the podium. He had no interest in cameras, no appetite for public statements. Echo remained seated at his left side, harness black against his sable coat, posture composed and unflinching despite the murmur of reporters and the metallic click of lenses adjusting. The sky above the courthouse was clear, and hard blue, the kind that made everything appear sharper than it felt. Sloane Kerrigan approached the podium precisely at noon. She wore a slate-gray suit tailored with exacting lines, shoulders structured, posture upright. Her dark hair was pinned back in a seamless twist. No stray strands, no visible fatigue. Her face carried composure, but beneath it something more strained tension along the edges of her jaw, a flicker behind her eyes when she scanned the crowd. She did not look at Declan. She looked at the microphones. Kerrigan Energy acknowledges the recovery conducted this week, she began, voice steady, trained for rooms like this. We extend our deepest sympathies to the Whitaker family. Grace Whitaker stood several rows back from the podium, wrapped in a charcoal coat. She did not lean on anyone. She did not cry. She listened. Sloane continued. Our founder, Daniel Kerrigan, passed away 4 years ago. Just recent findings suggest decisions made during the decommissioning of the Northwind research platform may not have followed intended internal protocols. Not accidental language. May not have followed. Intended. Internal. Naomi stood beside Declan, arms folded tightly across her chest. She's distancing the company from the founder, Naomi murmured. Declan said nothing. Sloane adjusted a stack of prepared papers. We have initiated full cooperation with state investigators. We are also establishing an independent review board to examine archival oversight failures. The word failure echoed hollowly. Deputy Reeves stood near the courthouse doors in uniform, posture formal but eyes watchful. The crowd shifted slightly as a new figure stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his build softened by age but still imposing. His beard was white and thick, trimmed close but full enough to command presence. His suit was dark, but not expensive, well-worn at the elbows. His skin bore deep lines carved by decades of exposure to courtroom battles. I'm Thomas Callahan, State Special Prosecutor. Declan had not expected the state to move this quickly. Callahan took position beside the podium after Sloane stepped back. His voice carried without amplification. An investigation has been formally opened, he announced. Evidence indicates that structural modifications were conducted post-submersion of the platform. Those modifications resulted in unlawful containment. Containment. The word hung heavy. Callahan did not dramatize. He did not soften. While the primary signatory is deceased, corporate liability remains subject to review. Sloane's posture remained straight, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edges of her notes. Echo's ears shifted forward. Declan watched her, not with anger, not with triumph, with measurement. A sudden gust of wind cut across the courthouse square. Papers lifted briefly from the podium. One sheet slipped loose. It fluttered down, not toward the press, but toward the steps below, where Echo rose before anyone else moved. He stepped forward, calm but purposeful, and placed his paw firmly on the page before it could tumble further. Declan stepped in behind him, bending to retrieve it. The document was not part of Sloane's prepared statement. It bore a scanned image, a signature. Daniel Kerrigan. And beneath it, authorization language referencing Containment Protocol Override. Sloane saw it. For the first time, her composure fractured. Only slightly. But enough. Declan handed the page to Callahan without a word. Callahan studied it briefly, then looked toward Sloane. "Was this disclosed during preliminary review?" he asked evenly. Sloane inhaled once. "It was archived in legacy documentation," she replied. "Archived," Callahan repeated. Reporters leaned forward. The cameras clicked louder. Grace did not move. Declan stepped back beside Echo. The dog lowered his head, calm again. The gust faded as quickly as it had come. The moment passed, but it had shifted something. Callahan addressed the crowd once more. "The investigation will proceed with full transparency." Sloane stepped away from the podium without further comment. She did not look at Declan as she exited through the side entrance. The crowd dispersed slowly. Grace approached Declan afterward. She stood closer this time. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. Declan looked toward the courthouse doors where Sloane had disappeared. "No," he said, "but it's open." Grace nodded. "I don't need revenge," she said. "I just needed truth." Echo leaned gently against her leg for a brief moment, steady, grounding. Grace placed one trembling hand on his head. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the dog alone. Naomi joined them, holding a folded copy of the signature document. "This ties the override directly to Kerrigan," she said. "And if override was authorized, someone deemed the boy an obstacle." Declan felt the weight of that word settle deeply. Obstacle. That's a 9-year-old child reduced to a variable. Deputy Reeves approached quietly. "State forensics confirmed restraint marks consistent with external fastening," he said. "This is moving toward indictment." Declan exhaled slowly. The courthouse square began to empty. The sky remained clear. Echo sat once more, scanning the thinning crowd without urgency. Grace turned toward the parking lot. "I'm taking him home tomorrow," she said softly. "The burial." Declan nodded. "I'll be there." She paused, looking at him with a steadiness he had not seen in her before. "You didn't let them keep him?" she said. Declan glanced at the courthouse. "No," he replied. "The water couldn't keep him." The words felt final, not as victory, but as completion. As Grace walked away, Naomi remained beside him. "You realize this will ripple," she said. "Corporate investigations don't stop cleanly." Declan nodded. "I know." Echo rose. The courthouse doors closed with a hollow echo. Somewhere inside, as conversations were already shifting tone. The lake had once held silence. Now silence had fractured. Declan looked down at Echo. The dog's gaze was steady, amber eyes reflecting light without agitation. He thought of steel seams, of weld marks, of signatures inked beneath fluorescent lights years ago. He thought of water pressing against metal, of weight applied deliberately, and of a boy who had waited 12 winters beneath that weight. The boy was home now. Responsibility would follow. Declan felt no celebration, only alignment. The geometry that had begun at the lake's edge had completed its arc. Truth had surfaced, and once surfaced, it did not return easily to the depths. Declan turned away from the courthouse and began walking toward the truck. Echo matched his stride. The wind carried no chill now, only movement. And for the first time since the lake had drawn him in, Declan felt something loosen. Not relief, not forgiveness, but stillness. The water had given up what it was forced to hold, and that was enough. Sometimes we think miracles must arrive loudly, with thunder, with clear answers, with everything suddenly resolved. But more often, miracles come quietly. They arrive when someone chooses to stop instead of walking past, when the heart listens before the mind has proof, when a dog senses what words cannot reach, and a person has the courage to trust that moment. Maybe God does not always remove the storm. Maybe He places the right person inside the storm at the exact moment they are needed, so no one has to face it alone. In our daily lives, we pass by many people carrying burdens we cannot see. A tired child, a silent fear, a door that only needs to be knocked on with gentleness. Faith does not exist only in churches or in prayers spoken out loud. Faith lives in choices, in compassion, in staying when leaving would be easier. If this story touched your heart, thank you for staying until the very end. Your time, your attention, and your willingness to listen are what give stories like this their meaning. Please share this video with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part of the story spoke to you most or where you are watching from. And if you believe in quiet miracles, in second chances, and in love that does not walk away, subscribe to this channel so we can continue this journey together. Finally, thank you once again for being here. May God watch over you, protect you through every season of life, and remind you that even in the coldest moments, you are never truly alone.